I think that this is a period for revitalization of human rights so that we do not accept these huge inequalities of very rich and very poor in our country. And I think this would be one of the post-pandemic lessons.
Olá, sejam bem-vindos ao canal Brasil, uma realização da FecomercioSP. Antes de acompanhar a nossa entrevista de hoje, não deixe de se inscrever no nosso canal aqui no YouTube e de nos seguir nas redes sociais. Nossa entrevistada neste programa é um ícone mundial na luta por justiça e pelos direitos humanos. Navi Pillay foi a primeira mulher não branca a atuar na Suprema Corte da África do Sul e defendeu os direitos de presos políticos durante o apartheid, incluindo Nelson Mandela. Além de ter sido juíza da Corte Penal Internacional em Haia, Navi Pillay serviu como alta comissária da ONU para os Direitos Humanos entre 2008 e 2014. Navi Pillay, it's an honor to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. I'm very happy to be on this program.
Thank you. So before we talk about your brilliant and extensive career in the field of human rights, I would like to start our discussion asking about current challenges amid COVID-19 pandemic. This crisis just exposed and confronted us with persisting inequalities and injustices. How do you see a post-pandemic world?
Speak from my experience as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights when I visited Brazil. As well in that capacity. And now as a South African sitting at home under lockdown like everybody else, our experiences in South Africa are similar to Brazil's with regard to COVID-19 because we are both countries with huge populations of very, very poor people. And so the social economic issues are important for us. But human rights are at the crux, the core of this crisis. That's why the experts have said it's at the center and the forefront, because the governments have to protect lives. They have to protect the population, so people come first. They have to adopt a human rights-based approach. And many people are doing this, but it's very alarming that Brazil is now one of the 4 countries that are most seriously affected. The United Nations has complimented our president for taking a wonderful approach of caution to protect all of us. I'm not saying it's easy under these times. So I know you asked me about after the pandemic, but it's very hard these days to think about after the pandemic when you are in the middle of it and there's so much uncertainty over when it will end and how many of us will lose our lives. And so of particular concern, as I said, for Brazil and for South Africa are that we are poor countries. We need the assistance of developed countries, and there are huge inequalities. So you have to address the needs of the poor, and I support the call for free public services provision for the poor, marginalized, including migrants and so on. I think that this is a period for revitalization of human rights so that we do not accept these huge inequalities of very rich and very poor in our country. And I think this would be one of the post-pandemic lessons. That, all right, it's easier to keep safe the rich in their big houses, including me, but how do you safeguard people who are living in informal settlements, the favelas your way, and in shacks where people share a little room, 15 people share the room? How are you going to keep social distancing there? There has to be provision of free water, sanitation, and access to health. So if we begin with that there, I see something positive in continuing with that kind of human rights approach after the pandemic.
You mentioned this revitalization of human rights. we have witnessed growing hostility towards human rights, as well as disregard about their relevance, not only by governments, but also by common people. How can we make human rights gain a meaning for every person and also boost empathy towards problems and injustices suffered by others?
It's true that the emergence of right-wing governments who seem to support industry development and are against climate change and conservation. We are alarmed about right-wing groups, mainly in Europe. We're alarmed about continuing dictatorships in Africa, for instance. However, let me speak to the resilience and solidarity amongst civil society. They will not put up with the continued trampling of their human rights. So their voices are very, very clear now during the pandemic and after that to resist these reactionary forces. And you see it everywhere. You look at the WHO meetings of yesterday, for instance. Their virtual meeting went very well with all the states except one or two key states. But there's solidarity amongst all those other states too. And that's what I would look at. I would not be too worried with the small groups of reactionary elements that are, there's even a resurgence of Nazism in Europe. I have a lot to do with the Nuremberg Principles Academy, for instance. So I'm aware of situations like that. And I'm comforted that that's a minority. And maybe we should examine what their frustrations are. There are groups of people who here in Brazil, in the United States, who are in fact opposing the restrictions on their personal freedoms, their sporting events and social events, the closure of bars. People are protesting against these because of their frustrations. The solution is to educate people, provide them with the scientific information and to brief the public regularly. The response to COVID-19 has to be science-based. It shouldn't be responding to individuals or simply to some businesses. It has to be based on what the medical people tell us.
Certainly. Well, now let's talk about your story. You grew up in apartheid as a South African woman of Indian descent. How did this experience shape your work as a human rights lawyer, and what triggered you to fight for the rights of others?
Well, I'm third generation Indian here, so it was my grandparents who were brought as indentured laborers from India by the British sugar plantation owners, and they were on contract to work. They couldn't leave. They were paid very poorly. We heard about the suffering of our forefathers and foremothers. Mahatma Gandhi called the conditions of their indenture as semi-slavery. But you look at that lot of people who had no hope for themselves. They literally cooked the grass and corn and adapted, but they invested in schools for their children. So that comes my parents' generation, who also just managed to get jobs like bus drivers. My father was a bus driver, my mother a housekeeper. That level of employment, because they were still oppressed, but they invested in their children. So here you have, say, my family with 2 judges and 2 school principals and accountants and business people and so on. And the next generation, this is our children, are doing even more. So this is the community investing in their children, investing in education, no matter what oppression and poverty that is sitting over you. They could have easily got involved in criminality. They did not do that. So some good values were handed down to us. I always grew up, and I was a lawyer for 30 years under apartheid, struggling through the courts. And at first you think you're the only one who's suffering, but the only problem in the world is here, because we were under apartheid and there was racial discrimination. Jobs were closed to people of color. This is why, you know, it was big news when President Mandela made me the first Black woman judge in this country. It was an acting appointment. Now that was big news because it was the first time. It only happened during our democracy. But let me assure you, Karina, that under apartheid, sometimes you really lose hope. And you really think, you believe all the propaganda that there is, that you are inferior, that there's something wrong with you, you'll never make it. There's such a huge load of that oppression over you. Then you get inspired by other people in the community. It was my poor community that sent me to university. They collected money and they sent me to university from high school. So we suffered, but the story 30 years into our democracy is that we are picking ourselves up out of that and not just looking to others. We making our own effort about it.
And your community sent you to Harvard, right?
No, not to Harvard, to the Natal University here. For Harvard, that was late in my career as a lawyer, after doing a number of these political cases where the African National Council members whom I defended were all sent to prison and life imprisonment. And they encouraged me to take their case overseas and see what other judges think about this case. Because we were convinced that they were innocent, they were struggling for freedom, but the state treated them as criminals. And the state security police used torture. And so much of the evidence in the courtroom came from witnesses who had been tortured to say what they were saying in the courtroom that convicted our people. So because of these issues, and that we were still trying to fight these cases in an apartheid court, the ANC clients encouraged me when I saw them on Robben Island prison to take their case outside the country. And that's when I applied to Harvard and got this scholarship.
Fantastic. Well, how was your learning experience of gaining self-confidence amid attempts of the authorities and the society in general to prove that you and any other person of color were inferior, as you have already mentioned?
It's when I listen to young people today and I see how they are brimming with self-confidence. They have such a good sense of who they are. I'm afraid we had to learn that, because I already said to you, even a person like me with all my qualifications, being a lawyer in the courtroom, had to really struggle to overcome these complexes. But when I got to Harvard, that was a real test, because there they were all very bright students. They were all younger than me, but I was already a lawyer. I realized that we cannot articulate our concerns, our demands and requests because of inadequate education, and that, you know, we didn't learn to speak up like the young Americans were. So that was a good learning experience for me, to learn to be self-confident and to speak up for your rights. Many people feel deeply emotionally about what's hurting them, but they're unable to speak about it. Yeah, I also learned from many women who came to see me when I was a lawyer. And at first I thought they were so weak because they'd just be coming and crying about domestic violence. I felt that they were weak because I was university educated, I had my own ego. And then they said to me, we've come to you because you're a woman and you would listen to us. So that is one of the skills I learned. You listen to people, identify what their problem is, what it is they want. And all this helped me when I became an international judge on the Rwanda tribunal, to listen to what it is the witnesses are telling you about wanting justice.
And you were often at Robben Island to work with Nelson Mandela and represent prisoners of the apartheid regime. What are the most striking memories you have from that time?
Well, firstly, I was not the lawyer for Mr. Mandela. He had his own lawyers. And Dalla Oma was one of them. He became our first Minister of Justice. But when Dalla Oma was the lawyer in Cape Town, I was a lawyer in Durban. We would meet often on these visits that I made to Robben Island prison. I must have been the first woman to go to that prison. It was an extremely scary place. You needed permits and you had to travel. Because I was a non-white person, they put me in the hold of this ferry boat. And it was a terrible crossing over rough seas to reach the island where Mr. Mandela and some of my clients were held. Of course, so I never met him in the prison, but obviously they all came to know about this young woman who was coming to the prison to see some of the clients. So when I went, the warders said to me, don't drink the water from the tap. We brought you water from mainland, from Cape Town. And so I immediately went to the tap in the waiting room, of course, and found it was very brackish, it was salty. And in the consultation room, we were only supposed to talk about their case. But we found ways and ways of communicating, sometimes by signals, sometimes writing a word and then crossing it out. And they all told me, yes, they immediately had bladder problems because of the water. But they had many other problems. They didn't have the prison regulations, so they didn't know what their rights were. They were being punished. One was a lawyer. He drew up a petition, and one of the first items is, can we have the prison regulations? And he drew up other grievances that they were all in a cell, and they brought in more people, but they didn't increase the food allowance for them. And some of them wanted to hold English language classes for those of their comrades who needed English lessons. These are the things they were asking for. And instead of talking to them, the prison authorities then imprisoned them, isolated him and called it a 6-month sentence of isolation with spare diet. And so as I was consulting them, I learned all this, but I had to keep it to myself, come out, discuss it with their families, discuss it with outside lawyers, because they wanted me to bring an application. And it had never been done before. Bring an application to the court to know what their rights are. But they cautioned me that Mr. Mandela was not in favor of approaching the courts, because you don't win in apartheid courts. They may just refuse everything, and that'll bring the ceiling down to his efforts to negotiate for changes in the prison. So it was a big decision which I made, but I didn't make it alone. I consulted experienced people. Anyway, we made the application, we won it, and for the very, very first time, the court spelled out that prisoners are not property, they have rights. And this applied not only to Mr. Mandela and the others on Robben Island, but prisons all over. Firstly, they must be given the prison regulations so they will know what their rights are. And if they are alleged to have broken any prison regulation, they can't just be sentenced by the prison authorities, because it's a court that sentenced them, and prison authorities can't penalize them further. So they have to bring a magistrate from Cape Town and hold a trial. And that meant, and the court said they have a right to a lawyer. So previously, no lawyer was able to visit Robben Island, except the lawyer visiting Mr. Mandela. They had special permission. I heard from other people who had served sentences on Robben Island prison. One man, Indris Naidu, wrote a book about it, and he said that they were so harsh, they were beaten. These are Mandela and all of them working in those chalk mines and so on. They were beaten, and once prison dogs were released, so they were bitten. This man in this Naidu had been bitten, but they had no right to a lawyer, and they couldn't complain about this to anyone. So when the court said they have a right to a lawyer, they have a right to a trial, they have a right to prison regulations, this was of huge benefit to them. And they have a right to get an education. If they want to study, they have a right to study. This meant a lot. Most of them, you know, were lawyers, and others used to books and reading. They told me that saved their lives on prison. So that was one of the good challenges. You always have to challenge injustices, because I'm a lawyer, through the courts. It's true you don't win all the time, but when you do, then it spells out the rights of people. And that application then benefited prisoners all over the country.
Excellent.
It's very important, because I understood it much better later. They don't lose their human rights once they're in prison. I understand now why WHO is advising governments to release wherever they can people who are in detention and in prison. Otherwise, they're going to die of COVID-19.
And how did the struggle and the thoughts of Mandela inspired you personally?
Oh, Mandela inspired all of us. Firstly, he made a tremendous speech at the trial, at his trial where he was sentenced to life imprisonment. And here he was prepared to sacrifice his life for the freedom of everybody and for democracy. That was the crux of his speech. And so he stood really tall there, certain that he was not a criminal, that he was a freedom fighter. That's his speech. And when he was sentenced to life imprisonment, you know, I'm aware that he had many opportunities where the authorities approached him. They said they will release him if he gives up the struggle and if he goes and stays in Sky, the rural area. If he does that, they will release him. And he could have bought those deals soon after he was imprisoned. Instead, he chose to spend 27 years in prison. I mean, he had a young wife, he had young daughters. Families suffer when the head of the family is in prison. So his sacrifice motivates a lot of us South Africans to follow principles, to avoid corruption. We have lots of complaints about corruption in the government, particularly the past regime. And everybody says, what happened to the good example set by Mr. Mandela? So he made sure that we have a good constitution and a Bill of Rights, spelling out equality and non-discrimination, and spelling out social and economic rights for all.
But by the way, when you were a judge of the High Court of South Africa, you advocated to include this equality clause in South Africa's constitution, right?
Now, the constitutional negotiation was a huge effort by many people in the struggle, and by many powerful experts and NGOs from outside who came to help. I played a small role because I was part of the Women's National Coalition. And when the women got together, they came out with a Bill of Rights on what they wanted. And they wanted equality. They wanted non-discrimination, including the right of sexual orientation. So that is in our constitution, contributed by the women. And when we got together, and you know, it was not easy because you were talking to everyone from groups, people you didn't agree with, right wing, left wing, young, old, different political parties. It was a real learning experience, but the women were the first to come up with a good document. And I'm happy to say that that got taken very seriously and put into the Bill of Rights in our constitution. So it's my indirect contribution, as did many people. But I'm very proud that we have the equality clause, I'm working now with many activists in the United States because the US Constitution does not have the right to equality, nor do they have rights to dignity that we have. It's very important that, for instance, that we have right to dignity in our Constitution, because right now, when it's COVID, the government has to treat people with dignity. You can't have poor people waiting in long lines for social grants and not grants and so on. So you have to treat them with dignity and treat the elderly with dignity. There's so much talk about the elderly are going to die anyway, so why provide them with health services? So I'm one of the elderly, I speak up for them as well. The elderly made many contributions, and and any criteria for providing health services shouldn't be on age, it should be for medical reasons to everyone.
Well, you touched upon the topic of women's rights. When you were a girl in South Africa, it was a consensus that girls should not have education. Yet this is still a reality in many parts of the world today. How did you overcome this obstacle, and how should we fight for girls' rights today as regards to education in particular?
Well, in my country, all that's in the past now because of the equality clause in the Constitution. There's equal education for boys and girls. There's poverty and unemployment are the big bugbears. But I agree with you, in many parts of the world, girls still have to struggle for an education. As High Commissioner, we trace some of the countries, quite a few of the countries such as Pakistan, as we know. There's still forced marriage or early marriage of young girls. I found that in Latin America. When I grew up, which was a long time ago, there was a clear prejudice against girls. The Indians, for instance, would not educate girls because they reasoned, well, they're going to get married anyway, so what's the point of educating? And my father, even though he was a bus driver with 7 children, and my mother was denied an education by her father, her father told her that if she went to school and learned to read and write, she'll write letters to boys, and therefore he never allowed her to go to school. And here you take these two people who ensured that all their children are educated, girls and boys. And my parents had to go through a lot of criticism for this from the Indian community, that's my community, where people said to them, why haven't you arranged marriages for your daughters? Why are you still allowing them and pickling them at home? You know, pickling is when you put fruit in a jar and you store that away somewhere. So they resisted that. They said no, they love all their children equally. So we overcame those prejudices. But there are still cultural and religious prejudices against women. And we all know that if you educate a woman, you educate a whole society. They bring up the whole society and everybody benefits.
Well, let's go back now to the genocide in Rwanda. When you were president of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, you ruled for the first time that sexual violence in conflict was a crime against humanity. You made it a war crime and not more a trophy of war. How were you able to make this achievement?
So that was in 1996, 1997. Up till then, rape and sexual violence in wars and conflicts just happened. I saw in some military journals of some countries that the soldiers were even encouraged, go and fight there and you can have those women as a reward. So that's why I said women were treated as trophies, women were treated as collateral damage. Now, there was incidents of rape happening during World War II, and it was touched very briefly in some very old trials like the Tokyo Tribunal. But in modern times, rape and sexual violence were not regarded as war crimes in conflict. So you see, if it's not regarded as a war crime, nobody investigates, nobody prosecutes, nobody listens to the women. So in this case, the prosecutors investigated the crimes, and it was because some brave survivors, men and women from Rwanda, who came over to testify what happened to them. And it was not easy. They were testifying about gang rapes upon them in the bushes, in the fields, and in the open public at the mayoral premises of this man, the mayor Akayesu, right in front of him. They were raped in public, but they came and described these incidences to us. So it's because of their evidence that we looked at the law and found that under international law, because there had never been a prosecution, there was no internationally accepted definition of rape. We looked at the definition in a number of states, and most of them, including my own country, South Africa, including UK, United States, I'm not sure about Brazil, rape was only what happened to women. And there had to be the penetration of the vagina by the penis. So only if there's proof of penetration, then it's rape. But in the former Yugoslavia, in that conflict, men and boys were also raped and sexually violated. And so, with some help from research, academics and so on, we came up with a new definition. And we said that rape is the physical invasion of a person of a sexual nature under coercive circumstance. So we felt that captured what rape is, and we said sexual violence is also the same, and sexual violence includes rape. It includes other kinds of acts, such as we heard evidence of a 16-year-old student who was ordered to and stripped naked and paraded in public. So we felt that is an act of sexual violence. We covered the whole spectrum. It's not easy when, and all judges know this, it's not easy when you are writing jurisprudence for the first time without a priest. But as I say, I credit the brave witnesses who told us. If we didn't have the evidence, we wouldn't have been able to build on it. And this is why you had the very first judgment in which I participated. Thank you for mentioning it. That rape is a war crime, rape and sexual violence. Rape is a crime against humanity. Rape is like torture, we said. It's another form of torture. And most importantly, we said in that particular case, rape constituted genocide because it was Tutsi women who were targeted. Only Tutsi women were targeted for rape and sexual violence. And the intention from the evidence was to destroy the Tutsi group as a whole. So that fell under the provisions, the criteria of the Genocide Convention. This is why you had that first decision.
And you also served as a judge in the International Criminal Court in The Hague. A few weeks ago, Felicien Kabuga, one of the main financiers of the genocide in Rwanda, was caught in Paris after 26 years as a fugitive. Is this a landmark in the fight of survivors and families of the victims?
This is a triumph for international justice, and mainly it's there for victims all over. And so international justice can't countenance it just because somebody is rich and powerful, or we can't find him that we should let him escape justice. So I think it's great news that the head of MICT, the mechanism, Serge Bramert, went after Kabuga. I remember this, and I might have been the judge who granted the order for the indictment of Kabuga because it was very, very early days. But in the cases, the media case all the evidence that we heard, his name kept coming up because Rwanda doesn't manufacture machetes. So where did these millions of machetes come from? Somebody bought them and brought them into the country. That's one of the allegations he faces. So after I completed 8.5 years on the United Nations Tribunal for Rwanda, I was elected to the International Criminal Court and served in The Hague there for more than 5 years. And the importance about the International Criminal Court is that it's the world's first permanent court. Not all states have signed up to it. The United States has not, Russia has not, China has not. And big countries like Pakistan, India, Philippines, especially in the Middle East, they have not. So it's not a universal court as yet. I hope it will become one, because none of us should support impunity for these very serious crimes. It only deals with these very serious crimes. So if you want an idea of what the court has done in its early stages, is, for me, the importance is what was lacking in the Rwanda Tribunal and the Yugoslavia Tribunal is that the Security Council only attended to prosecution and punishment. It did not attend to help for the victims. What about the victims? Hearing their voices in the courtroom. They had no say in the courtroom. They had no say over who gets charged and what kind of charges should be brought against them. And they had no reparation, nothing, for no redress. So this has been put into the Rome Statute for the ICC, and I sat as an appeals judge on some of the decisions where we spelt out that victims have rights to participate in court proceedings. They can have their own lawyer, they can question the accused, they can ask to see documents and so on. And the statute is very clear that they are entitled to reparation. So the ICC has set up a trust fund and invited donations to provide some reparation or compensation for victims who have suffered. So I thought these are very important steps towards the full meaning of justice for victims.
And Navi Pillay, you were a High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations between 2008 and 2014. What were your main challenges and your main legacy?
Well, firstly, I found after the ambassadors complained about it, that there were very few people from developing countries, very few staff from developing countries were in high-level positions. For instance, of all the offices of the High Commissioner in Africa, there was not a single African heading that office. There was not a single woman of color heading any office. So I felt I can't tolerate apartheid at that level as High Commissioner for Human Rights. I was aware that certain countries from the countries feel it's their money that is paying for these international institutions, and they behave almost as if it's their citizens who should get priority in jobs. So I addressed that one. But from a human rights point of view, I found there was a skewed, a slanted emphasis on civil and political rights, whereas the right to development and economic and social rights were priorities for developing countries. But one minister in the north told me there is no such right as right to development. And social economic projects and programs that the High Commissioner wanted to embark on were not treated favorably by donor countries, because they wanted you to focus in faraway places. They told me that too. Focus on the killings that are going on in Syria and South Sudan and so on, and not about what's happening in our backyard. So if we looked at the situation of migrants and how they're being treated in Europe, that was a challenge about what the emphasis they wanted to place. And this is what I brought up the socioeconomic challenges, contributed very strongly to having human rights language in the development agenda. So now we have Agenda 30, which is a human rights program. None of that was easy. It was a huge struggle to mainstream human rights, as we said. But let me say, I had huge support from ambassadors from Latin American countries because they understood what development and social economic rights and peace means to Latin America. So I have great support from them and many African countries. Other things I did for the very first time is put LGBTIQ issues on the agenda of the United Nations. It had never been done before because of resistance from certain states who said we should not be introducing new international standards. We should only be focusing on universally accepted standards. This is creating new norms, they said. And I said, well, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights doesn't say these are human rights of everyone except women, except LGBTI people, or except victims of caste-based discrimination. That was the other thing that civil society in India, for instance, was fighting for years and years and years, for decades, to have caste addressed in the international fora. So the country concerned was not happy with me, but that is precisely what we did. We had caste-based discrimination put on the agenda as we did with LGBTI issues, and indigenous people. I played a role there because they struggled so much to get their convention respected and to play an equal role as rapporteurs in their first UN conference. And I had to fly to New York to speak to the president of the UN General Assembly to say, you have to respect the indigenous people, it's their conference. The states were arguing it's a states conference, not the NGO. So the indigenous representative cannot be one of the rapporteurs up there on the podium. That was their argument. And mine was, this is their conference. They were in the PrepComs, you have to let them do that. So as I said, everything a struggle, and I felt that we made great strides in spreading awareness of human rights, standards, and norms. And of course, in conflict situations, the General Assembly, the Security Council, and the Human Rights Council, none of these bodies was looking at Sri Lanka, even though people were being bombed and we could watch that on our screens. So that was something that I pushed for, and I'm still supporting their cause for justice. We had to file many, many reports on Palestine. That's the Human Rights Council resolution. So we investigated and filed like 12 reports every year on various violations in the occupied territory. That was a challenge because Israel and their lobby groups, disliked us doing that, and they felt that Israel was being targeted and badgered, whereas there are other terrible situations in other countries that were escaping. Why the focus on Israel? Well, Israel and apartheid South Africa were the focus of the old Human Rights Commission. And when the Human Rights Council was created, apartheid ended and they continued focusing on the occupation. So a long story, but these are some of the challenges. And so let me briefly say that when I started as High Commissioner, I found that the office would write one op-ed to spread a human rights message, and then you beg the newspapers, particularly New York Times, to publish that article. They will either reject it or eventually it will appear on page 13 of some newspaper. How many people would have seen that message? So in a brilliant opportunity opened up to us with social media. So as we use social media to spread human rights messages, my office would report, well, the message, the statement that you made this morning has now been seen by 4 million people, 4 million hits and so on. So social media helped to educate people on human rights.
So we have two mandates dedicated to promoting human rights for all, everywhere, and without any discrimination, and paving the way for the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And today, a few countries have withdrawn their membership from some UN agencies. Briefly, how do you see the future of the organization?
Because the UN didn't start up dealing with humanitarian issues and human rights issues. It was really a dispute resolution for states. It was civil society who pressured and pressured so that the UN is now recognized as norm-based. They have a charter. They have to take every step to advance every one of those charter provisions. So I feel whatever setbacks we experiencing now with powerful states withdrawing their funds because they didn't get their candidate elected as the head of WHO, for instance, I experienced this too. This constant, we won't give you funds if you address this issue or that issue. One threat made to me was not to influence my office on reproductive rights. And that is, reproductive rights is crucial for women all over the world. Just because the anti-abortion lobby in the US is so powerful, they use their funding to ensure that these issues are not addressed. So continually, UN's people working in the UN as well as states representatives have met these challenges. So I think the UN will continue to thrive as a multilateral institution. We see now, COVID-19 cannot be fought by a single state. It has to have the cooperation and solidarity of the whole world. Well, that's the key message of the United Nations. We need the United Nations, and no matter what challenges we face, UNESCO is still thriving, even though their funding has been withdrawn by a major contributor, the United States. Threat now from the United States to withdraw funding WHO. So civil society, though, is consistent in what it is they want. They're very clear that they want all these rights to be realized. And they want governments to deliver on their undertakings and their obligations to deliver on these rights.
Very important.
So to conclude, then, I see unilateralism that is being raised by some right-wingers in several countries, some right-wing leaders that are threatening to take us back from where we've advanced. Yeah, they will not succeed. They will fail because civil society will not give up these huge advances that have been made for the human rights of everyone in this world. The slogan is "Leave none behind."
Yeah, this is a strong and important message. And as a High Commissioner, you visited Brazil. How do you see the situation of human rights in Brazil at the moment?
Oh, I'm deeply saddened by the human rights situation in Brazil. I'm also doing some work for World Wildlife Fund for Nature, and I'm really concerned about conservation of nature rather than depleting the forest for commercial crops. That is one of the complaints against Brazil. But however, Brazil has not done enough to address poverty in that country, to ensure that everyone is educated, to stop early pregnancies, many social issues. I begin by saying developed countries should help a country such as Brazil. It's a huge country with many problems. However, I have enormous respect for the people of Brazil and NGOs there. I've met so many of them when I came as High Commissioner for Human Rights. They're very strong. I learned many lessons actually from women human rights defenders in Brazil, because they address everybody's concerns, whether it's LGBTI or children or the environment. These women human rights defenders are on the front line, and I see hope there. So deeply saddened by what's happening. Appeal to the government in power to adopt human rights-based approaches, because this is what will help advance the country, not favoring a few in business and powerful elites and so on. That is not going to. You have to invest in the people.
Navi Pillay, thank you so much for this interview. It was amazing to talk to you and learn so much from your experience.
Well, thank you for your questions, Karina. Thank you very much for this opportunity.